December 1983, the Mediterranean Sea off the coast of Beirut. A shape emerges from the horizon that seems torn from another era. 900 feet of gray steel, guns the size of school buses, a warship built to fight Imperial Japan, now pointing those same barrels at the hills of Lebanon. The USS New Jersey, the most powerful surface combatant ever constructed, had returned from retirement, and she was about to unleash hell. The men watching from the shores of Beirut had never seen anything like it. Neither had the militias hiding in the Chouf Mountains. When those 16-inch guns roared to life, shells weighing as much as a Volkswagen Beetle would arc through the sky at supersonic speeds, landing with the force of a small earthquake. This was not a weapon of the modern age. This was a dinosaur, and the Reagan administration had deliberately pulled her from extinction. But why? Why send a 40-year-old battleship, a relic of a war that ended before most of the Marines on the ground were even born, into a conflict defined by car bombs, snipers, and faceless militias? The answer reveals one of the most controversial and misunderstood chapters of American military intervention in the Middle East. If you want to understand how great powers stumble into quagmires, how good intentions collapse into tragedy, and how even the mightiest weapons can prove useless against the wrong enemy, then you need to understand what happened in Beirut. Subscribe to this channel and comment below where you are watching from. This is a story that deserves to be remembered. To understand why a World War II battleship ended up bombarding the mountains of Lebanon, we need to go back to the summer of 1982. Lebanon had been tearing itself apart for 7 years in a brutal civil war. Christians against Muslims, Palestinians against Lebanese, Syrians against everyone. The country that had once been called the Paris of the Middle East had become a killing ground. Beirut itself was divided by the infamous Green Line, a no-man's land of rubble and snipers separating east and west. Into this chaos came the Israeli Defense Forces. On June 6, 1982, Israel launched Operation Peace for Galilee, a massive invasion aimed at destroying the Palestine Liberation Organization, which had been using southern Lebanon as a base to launch attacks into Israel. The invasion was tacitly approved by the United States, which provided military support to Israel in the form of arms and materiel. Within weeks, Israeli forces had pushed all the way to Beirut, surrounding the city and trapping thousands of PLO fighters inside. The siege of Beirut lasted through the scorching summer. Israeli artillery and aircraft pounded West Beirut relentlessly. Civilian casualties mounted. The images broadcast around the world were devastating. Pressure grew for a diplomatic solution. That solution came in August 1982 in the form of a multinational peacekeeping force. The United States, France, and Italy would send troops to Beirut to oversee the evacuation of PLO fighters from Lebanon. It was supposed to be a limited mission: get in, supervise the withdrawal, get out. 800 Marines from the 32nd Marine Amphibious Unit went ashore on August 25th. Their mission was described as providing a presence in Beirut, offering stability so the Lebanese government could regain control. They were peacekeepers. They carried weapons but were not supposed to use them except in self-defense. The rules of engagement were strict. The hope was that their mere presence, the sight of American uniforms, would calm the situation. The PLO evacuation went smoothly. By September 1st, the last Palestinian fighters had left Beirut on ships bound for Tunisia. The Marines began withdrawing. Mission accomplished, or so it seemed. Then everything fell apart. On September 14th, a massive bomb exploded at the headquarters of the Lebanese Phalangist Party, killing President-elect Bachir Gemayel, the young Christian leader the Americans had hoped would unite Lebanon. Gemayel had been Washington's man, a charismatic figure who promised to rebuild his shattered nation. His assassination sent shockwaves through Beirut. The Israelis, who had been planning to withdraw, instead pushed into West Beirut, claiming they needed to restore order. What followed was one of the darkest chapters of the Lebanese Civil War. Between September 16th and 18th, Christian Phalangist militiamen entered the Sabra and Shatila refugee camps in West Beirut. Israeli forces surrounded the camps and provided illumination with flares through the night. What happened inside those camps was a massacre. Hundreds, possibly thousands, of Palestinian civilians, men, women, children, and elderly, were systematically eliminated. The exact death toll has never been determined. Estimates range from several hundred to over 3,000. The images that emerged were horrifying. Bodies piled in alleyways, entire families cut down in their homes. The international outcry was immediate and fierce. The massacre shattered any remaining hope for a quick resolution. Lebanon descended deeper into chaos, and the pressure on Washington to do something, anything, became overwhelming. President Ronald Reagan ordered the Marines back. On September 29, 1982, elements of the 32nd Marine Amphibious Unit returned to Beirut, this time as part of a reconstituted multinational force. Their mission had changed, though exactly how remained unclear. They were still officially peacekeepers, but the peace they were supposed to keep no longer existed. The Marines set up their headquarters at Beirut International Airport, a flat, exposed position surrounded on three sides by hostile territory. It was not a defensible position by any military standard, but the choice was deliberate. The Marines were not there to fight. They were there to be seen, to project American presence, and reassure the Lebanese government. The mission was political, not tactical. As one officer later explained, you could have sent Peace Corps volunteers and achieved the same effect as long as they wore uniforms. The military significance was simply that the men were in military uniform. The problem was that the various factions fighting in Lebanon did not see the Marines as neutral peacekeepers. From the perspective of the Druze militias in the Chouf Mountains, the Shia communities in West Beirut, and their Syrian and Iranian backers, the Americans had picked a side. They were supporting the Lebanese government, which was dominated by Christians. They were allied with Israel, which had just invaded and occupied large portions of the country. American support for Lebanese President Amin Gemayel, the brother of the assassinated Bashir, and for the Lebanese armed forces alienated much of the population. The Marines at the airport became targets. At first, the attacks were sporadic. Sniper fire, the occasional mortar round. The Marines were under strict orders not to escalate. They hunkered down, returned fire only when directly engaged, and tried to maintain the fiction that they were neutral. But the fiction was becoming impossible to sustain. In April 1983, a truck packed with explosives drove into the American embassy in Beirut. The blast killed 60 people, including 17 Americans, among them the entire CIA station for the Middle East. The bombing was a warning shot across the bow. A new force had emerged in Lebanon, one that would change the nature of warfare in the Middle East. That force was Hezbollah. In 1982, the Islamic Republic of Iran had established a presence in the Syrian-controlled Bekaa Valley. From that base, Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps founded, financed, trained, and equipped Hezbollah to operate as a proxy army. The motivations were complex. Iran was fighting a brutal war with Iraq, a war in which the United States was quietly supporting Saddam Hussein with intelligence and economic aid. America's support for Iraq, combined with its support for Israel and the Lebanese government, made the United States a target, and Hezbollah's weapon of choice was the suicide bomber. The summer of 1983 was brutal for the Marines at Beirut Airport. The security situation deteriorated rapidly. Mortar and rocket attacks became routine. On August 10th and 11th, an estimated 35 rounds of mortar and rocket fire landed on American positions, wounding one Marine. The men were living in a combat zone but were not allowed to fight back effectively. The rules of engagement were paralyzing. On August 28th, American peacekeepers returned fire for the first time after constant harassment. The next day, American artillery silenced a Druz battery after 2 Marines were killed in a mortar attack. The pretense of neutrality was collapsing. Then came the decisive escalation. On September 19, 1983, the destroyer USS John Rogers and the nuclear cruiser USS Virginia, operating off the coast of Beirut, conducted a naval bombardment on the town of Souk al-Garb in the hills overlooking Beirut. The Lebanese army was nearly overrun by Syrian-backed Druze militiamen and Palestinian guerrillas. American naval gunfire saved them. But in doing so, the United States crossed a line. The Americans were no longer peacekeepers. They were combatants. The consequences would be catastrophic. October 23, 1983, 6:22 in the morning. A yellow Mercedes truck drove into the parking lot of the Marine Barracks at Beirut International Airport. The guard at the gate had no ammunition in his weapon. The rules of engagement prohibited loaded weapons at the post. He could only watch as the truck accelerated toward the building. The driver was smiling. The truck crashed through a wire fence, passed between 2 guard posts, and entered the building's ground floor lobby. Then it detonated. The bomb contained the equivalent of 12,000 pounds of TNT, later enhanced with compressed gas canisters to increase the blast effect. It was the largest non-nuclear explosion since World War II. The 4-story concrete building, the battalion landing team headquarters housing the 1st Battalion 8th Marines, simply ceased to exist. The blast lifted the entire structure into the air before it collapsed in on itself. 241 American servicemen died in an instant. It was the deadliest day for the Marine Corps since Iwo Jima. Simultaneously, a second truck bomb struck the French paratroop barracks 2 miles away, killing 58 French soldiers. The coordinated attack was surgical, devastating, and unprecedented. Nothing in American military experience had prepared the Marines for this kind of enemy. This was not conventional warfare. There was no front line, no enemy army to engage, no territory to seize. The enemy wore no uniform, could not be distinguished from civilians, and considered death not a cost, but a reward. The Reagan administration faced an impossible dilemma. American blood had been spilled on a massive scale. The pressure to retaliate was overwhelming. But against whom? The intelligence pointed toward Iran and the newly formed Hezbollah. But the evidence was not yet conclusive enough for military action. Secretary of Defense Caspar Weinberger lobbied against strikes, uncertain of the targets and worried about escalation. President Reagan assembled his national security team and approved a joint American-French air assault on the Sheikh Abdullah Barracks in Baalbek, where the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps was believed to be training Hezbollah militants. But the mission was canceled at the last minute. Weinberger's objections prevailed. If retaliation against the bombers was off the table, then the administration needed another way to demonstrate American power and resolve. Enter the dinosaur. The USS New Jersey was not supposed to exist in 1983. She had been built during World War II, launched in December 1942 and commissioned in May 1943. During that war, she served as the flagship for Admiral William Halsey's Third Fleet, bombarding Japanese positions across the Pacific. Her 9 16-inch guns could hurl a 2,000-pound shell over 20 miles. Her armor was designed to withstand hits from enemy battleships. She was a weapon from an era of total war, built to slug it out with Imperial Japan's finest. After the war, she was decommissioned, reactivated for the Korean War, decommissioned again, reactivated for Vietnam, and then retired once more. By 1982, she had been sitting in mothballs at the Puget Sound Naval Shipyard for 13 years. Conventional wisdom held that the age of the battleship was over. Aircraft carriers dominated naval warfare. Missiles had replaced guns. The New Jersey and her sisters were museum pieces. Then Ronald Reagan became president. Reagan came to office promising to rebuild American military power after what he saw as the decline of the Carter years. His administration pursued a 600-ship Navy, a massive expansion intended to challenge Soviet naval power worldwide. Part of that buildup involved bringing the Iowa-class battleships out of retirement. They were modernized with cruise missiles, Harpoon anti-ship missiles, and Phalanx close-in weapon systems. But they retained their original main armament, those 9 16-inch guns arranged in 3 triple turrets. The reactivation was controversial. Critics called it a waste of money, a sentimental attachment to obsolete weapons. Supporters argued that the battleships filled a niche no other vessel could, naval gunfire support for amphibious operations. And the psychological impact of a battleship, the sheer menace of her presence, was hard to quantify but undeniably real. On December 14, 1983, less than 2 months after the barracks bombing, the USS New Jersey arrived off the coast of Beirut. Her mission was to support the multinational force and the Lebanese army against Syrian-backed militias in the mountains overlooking the city. She represented something the cruise missiles and jet aircraft could not: visible, tangible, overwhelming American power. When those 16-inch guns fired, everyone for miles around knew it. The flash lit up the night. The sound was like rolling thunder. The shells created craters large enough to swallow a house. For the Marines still stationed at the airport, the New Jersey was a symbol of protection. For the militias in the Chouf Mountains, she was terror incarnate. This is what many veterans of Beirut remember most vividly. Not the political complications, not the questionable strategy, but the visceral reassurance of having that gray behemoth offshore, knowing that if things went wrong, she could erase entire grid squares from the map. The New Jersey conducted multiple fire missions over the following weeks. Her targets were Syrian and Druze positions in the mountains, anti-aircraft sites, artillery batteries, troop concentrations, and command posts. The firepower was immense. A full broadside from a battleship, all 9 guns firing simultaneously, delivered more explosive force than a tactical nuclear weapon. But there was a problem. The terrain around Beirut was not like the Pacific Islands the New Jersey had been designed to pulverize. The mountains were full of small villages, winding roads, hidden bunkers. The enemy did not mass in the open where 16-inch shells could do maximum damage. They infiltrated, they dispersed, they hid among civilians. And intelligence was fragmentary at best. Who exactly was the New Jersey shooting at? Were the targets military or civilian? The questions were often impossible to answer until after the shells landed, and even when the intelligence was good, the weapon was imprecise by modern standards. The New Jersey's guns could hit a target area reliably, but that target area was measured in hundreds of meters. Against a fortified position, that was fine. Against a militia hiding in a village, it was a recipe for civilian casualties. The bombardment inflamed opinion across Lebanon and the wider Arab world. To the Druze, the Shia, and their allies, the United States had dropped all pretense of peacekeeping. America was at war with them. The New Jersey became a symbol of American arrogance, American brutality, American contempt for Arab lives. Subscribe and like this video if you are finding this history compelling. The debate over whether the battleship's firepower helped or hurt the American position in Lebanon continues to this day. What made the Lebanon intervention so tragic was the gap between intentions and reality. The Reagan administration genuinely believed it was helping. The multinational force was supposed to stabilize Lebanon, give the legitimate government time to reassert control, and create the conditions for peace. The Marines were not conquerors. They were peacekeepers. They lived under restrictive rules of engagement precisely because the mission was not supposed to be military. But good intentions are not strategy. The United States walked into Lebanon without a clear understanding of the forces at play, without a plan for what victory looked like, without any appreciation of how its presence would be perceived by the various factions. American policymakers saw a simple narrative: legitimate government versus terrorists and Syrian puppets. The reality was infinitely more complicated. Lebanon was not a country with a civil war. It was a civil war pretending to be a country. Power was divided among dozens of sectarian militias, foreign sponsors, criminal networks, and feudal warlords. The idea that American presence would somehow impose order was fantasy. Every action the United States took, every shell the New Jersey fired, every position the Marines defended, pushed some faction further into opposition. By supporting the Lebanese army, America made enemies of everyone the Lebanese army was fighting. By bombarding the Druze, America guaranteed Druze hostility for generations. By aligning with Israel, America inherited all of Israel's enemies. The Marines in Beirut were caught in the middle of a war that was not theirs, fighting enemies they could not identify for objectives no one could clearly define. The end came quickly. On February 7, 1984, President Reagan ordered the Marines to begin withdrawing from Lebanon. Congressional support for the mission had evaporated after the barracks bombing. The American public, watching the images of body bags coming home, had no appetite for an open-ended commitment in a country most could not find on a map. The withdrawal was completed on February 26th. As the last Marines evacuated from Beirut International Airport, fighting erupted between the Lebanese army and Druze militia in the nearby Chouf Mountains. One officer commented dryly that this ceasefire is getting louder. The New Jersey remained offshore for several more months, firing occasional missions in support of the Lebanese government. But without ground forces, without a coherent strategy, the bombardments accomplished nothing permanent. By April 1984, she had departed Lebanese waters. The mission was over. What did the United States achieve in Lebanon? The honest answer is nothing. The peacekeeping force failed to keep the peace. The Lebanese government the Americans supported eventually collapsed. The Syrian occupation that the United States opposed continued for another 20 years. The militias the New Jersey bombarded, particularly Hezbollah, emerged stronger than ever. Hezbollah learned from Beirut that suicide attacks worked. They drove out the Americans. They drove out the French. They established a template for asymmetric warfare that would be replicated from Iraq to Afghanistan. The 1983 barracks bombing was the deadliest terrorist attack against Americans until September 11, 2001. Many of the same networks, the same techniques, the same ideology would connect Beirut to the Twin Towers. The human cost was staggering. 241 American servicemen, 58 French paratroopers, hundreds, perhaps thousands, of Lebanese civilians caught in the crossfire, all for a mission that had no clear objective and no realistic chance of success. And yet, the lessons went unlearned. The Weinberger Doctrine, developed in response to Lebanon, laid out strict criteria for committing American troops to combat, clear objectives, public support, commitment to win. It was forgotten within a decade. The same mistakes made in Beirut would be repeated in Somalia, in Iraq, in Afghanistan. The pattern is depressingly familiar. A crisis demands action. The military is deployed without a clear political strategy. Initial success gives way to quagmire. The enemy adapts faster than American policy. Casualties mount. Public support erodes. Withdrawal follows, leaving behind chaos worse than what existed before intervention. The USS New Jersey returned to the United States and was decommissioned for the final time in February 1991, shortly after the Gulf War. She never fired her guns in anger again. Today she is a museum ship, moored on the Camden waterfront across the Delaware River from Philadelphia. Visitors can walk her decks, stand in her turrets, and try to imagine what it was like when those massive guns roared. She is a monument to an era of warfare that has passed. The battles she was built to fight, ship against ship, fleet against fleet, ended with the Japanese surrender in Tokyo Bay. Every deployment after World War II was a kind of afterlife, a dinosaur called from extinction to fight wars for which she was never designed. But there is something poignant about her story in Lebanon. Here was the most powerful gun platform ever put to sea, capable of destroying anything it could see, and she was helpless against the real enemy. You cannot shell an idea. You cannot bombard fanaticism into submission. You cannot win a counterinsurgency with 16-inch guns. The New Jersey could devastate a hillside, but she could not prevent a truck bomb. She could terrorize militiamen, but she could not win their hearts. She could project American power with spectacular violence, but she could not translate that violence into political victory. That is the lesson of Lebanon. The United States went in with the best intentions, backed by overwhelming military force, and achieved nothing except tragedy. The dinosaur that emerged from the past could roar loud enough to shake the mountains, but roaring is not winning. 40 years later, the reverberations of Beirut still echo. Hezbollah, born in the chaos of the Lebanese civil war, nurtured by Iran, hardened by conflict with Israel, has become one of the most formidable non-state military forces in the world. The tactics pioneered in Beirut, the suicide bombings, the kidnappings, the asymmetric warfare, spread across the region and eventually around the globe. The men who planned the barracks bombing would go on to plan other attacks, train other operatives, build networks that stretched from South America to Southeast Asia. American policymakers have wrestled with the legacy ever since. Some argue that the withdrawal from Lebanon was a catastrophic signal of weakness, that it encouraged further attacks against American interests by demonstrating that terrorism works. Others argue that the intervention itself was the mistake, that American forces had no business in the middle of someone else's civil war, that the deaths in Beirut were the predictable consequence of mission creep and strategic confusion. Both sides have a point, but perhaps the most important lesson is simpler. Military power is a tool, not a strategy. The mightiest weapons in the world are useless without clear objectives, without realistic assessments of the enemy, without political will to see a mission through. The USS New Jersey was the most powerful surface combatant ever built. She was a dinosaur in the best and worst senses, magnificent, terrifying, and utterly unable to adapt to a world that had moved beyond her. The mountains of Lebanon absorbed her shells and produced only more enemies. The men who died in the barracks bombing deserved better than a mission that was unclear from the start and abandoned when it became too costly. They deserved leadership that understood what they were being asked to do and had a realistic plan to achieve it. They did not get it, and their sacrifice, 241 lives, remains a monument to the limits of American power and the cost of strategic confusion. If you made it this far, subscribe to the channel and leave a comment about what topic you want covered next. History remembers those who learn from the past. The question is whether we ever will.